If we take the skills that are required for procurement, now if I take the skills base of which procurement practitioners come off, they generally start from being a buyer. And buyers are generally trained in the broad perspective of purchasing commodities, ballpoint pens, things that all look the same. You know, you get it all off the shelf and they look the same, so they should cost the same. The difference that we should be seeing in the skills base related to the procurement practitioners should be where they must have exposure to the environment of infrastructure. What does it cost? What goes into delivering it? In driving the decision. Now, I think there was an overzealous approach to what was supposed to be well-functioning cross-functional teams. That notion was punted, I think, in the early 2000s, where initially infrastructure in public sector, you generally had a department capacitated by people from a technical background who drove that process. And then what happened is there was the notion that you needed to form cross-functional teams. You no longer had tender boards who had that oversight. And the cross-functional team was supposed to have, yes, a procurement practitioner who looked after the process. The technical person who knew the most about what you're procuring. You probably had other practitioners, legal, to look at the risks and. The unfortunate reality is that very little of that cross-functional teams has actually been effected, and they haven't been implemented effectively. So you had this notion that the procurement owns the process and they involve the other knowledgeable people to a very limited extent. Where they need to start making the financial judgment is where I think the lacking was most prevalent. In respect that they then gravitated towards the notion that you're saving yourself money, but you're not looking at what are you compromising in that trade-off. It's all good to get something cheaper, but what are you giving up? And do you really know in what ballpark these kind of services should cost? So we firmly believe that we need to upskill the procurement practitioners in public sector so that they are familiar and they're more knowledgeable in the area of infrastructure, because your thinking and your decision making, it should apply as in any procurement environment to, in some instances, you're buying something that you're going to consume almost immediately, and that is an easy decision to make. My ballpoint pens, cheap ballpoint pens, I write 3 times, I throw them away. When I buy and invest as a country in infrastructure, and I want this infrastructure to last me 20 to 30 years, you need to know where you're saving money and how you're going to save money. So you need to have a more holistic view. So your role as a procurement practitioner is not limited specifically to what I'm buying now. It's how is the decision I make on the procurement now going to bode us well for the investment we're making in our infrastructure over the next 20, 30 years. What do I mean by that? The simplest analogy is, and in the procurement realm, if I go into a computer shop and I see a cheap printer, do I necessarily buy that printer? The answer should be a resounding no. I must go and look at what do the cartridges cost me, because that cartridges would cost me 3 times the price in a year that I own that printer, so it may not be the wisest decision. Likewise, in infrastructure, you need to look at what are the cost components. Firstly, my consulting. That's about, if you take the 30-year, the value of the asset that you invested in, the cost. Over 30 years, your consulting costs constitute about 1 to 2% of those costs. Then you've got another 30 to 40% is the costs you're going to incur during the construction phase of that project. The remaining costs, as much as 50 to 60% almost, are sitting in operations and maintenance. In procuring the services of consulting engineers, we've put a lot of energy into trying to save money on that 1-2%. We've left the rest on the table. It explains why your infrastructure quality is bad, because you haven't had the best expertise exercising oversight. It explains why you pick up operation and maintenance issues down the line, which your municipalities sit with and can't cope with, because you might have made the wrong decisions. There might have been insufficient insight invested in the advice that you are procuring. And that is why we say that you need to have more knowledgeable people in procuring infrastructure, because it's not an off-the-shelf, I'm buying something. You need to know what's the impact for the bigger picture.